Thank you all for coming out here, and thanks a ton to Vibhuti Ramchandran for inviting me, and to Philip for also inviting me and making it happen, and to Jessica and Jewel for taking on all the arrangements. I have bad news. The article is really, it's sort of on the same content, but you may have to read it anyway. So today I'm going to talk about law and the Indian men's rights groups and their relationship to law, because I thought your brand new Global Studies department has so many folks who work on law in different aspects. I thought it would be fun to do that. So if you have like a burning quick question in the middle, you can raise your hand, but mostly we'll save some time for questions at the end, right? That's our plan. So as Phil mentioned, I had been working on how feminist groups deal with law over time for my last monograph. And so here we are looking at the fact that as women's organizations, often feminist organizations, have mobilized the Indian state and elsewhere in the world since the 1980s to formulate a slate of laws around intimate violence and around marriage. At the same time, men's groups globally since the 70s have formed in counterpoint to challenge definitions of violence, definitions of alimony, etc. So today we're going to talk about this kind of well-organized Indian men's rights movement. So MRM, or the men's rights movement, refers to the movement. You'll hear me say MRA sometimes, which is men's rights activists, right? So the individuals. So this well-organized Indian men's rights movement holds weekly meetings and an annual conference. It makes international alliances. It participates in a series of civic and political actions that I'm going to tell you. But I want to begin by showing you one of their recent actions. So this is 150 men who gathered at the auspicious Manikarnika Ghat in Varanasi, deemed to be a holy place, in August 2018 for this very familiar, customary Hindu death ritual in which the soul is freed from the cycle of life through the mediation of primarily male lineage members. So in this case, the mourners that you see here were these Indian men's rights activists, MREs, and the non-corporeal ashes whose funeral they were having were those of, quote, marital relations and gynocentric feminism, they said. So participants reported that they had performed, quote, the last rites of the corrupted form of feminism as it prevails in the society at present, and, quote, last rites of the bias and discrimination against men as part of a struggle of, in their words, fighting for the rights of men. So alongside, they held another ritual called Pishachini Mukti Puja, which I have translated as freeing the female demon, conducted alongside, which they say is to get rid of the bad memory of past relationships and shed their wives of toxic feminism. So, anthropologists love rituals. We look at rituals from basketball game watching to weddings to exorcisms, because rituals have this performative potential, right? They purport to create common moments of joy or mourning, to express ethnic and religious identity, to forge nationalism. Those of you who've taken answer classes, I'm sure, have seen this in different ways. So here, as part of the MRM, this funeral ritual proclaims that husbands are harassed by laws and policies of divorce, gender-based violence, and property. So they attribute the problems to the feminist dominance of governance, they say, and to electorally greedy politicians who choose to listen to feminists, according to them. So, as you can see here, this event draws on the symbolic domain of Hindu death rituals, for its emotional registers. You are supposed to see in this grief, loss, funerals as this liminal space for moving on to a normal life, which allows you to move on to the normal life. So it is religious in form, but I'm going to sort of argue that it is a technique of engaging law. Here expressing a critique of marriage law as deadly for men and the men's rights movements as a liberating antidote, right? So, but I also find this a really kind of confusing set of metaphors. So like me, you might find yourself dizzy from the dissonances of metaphors. So just to name some of the ways in which it's confusing, the metaphors are confusing. Is feminism now dead? Had it been healthy and alive, or was it being wishfully consigned to die? Were they free of their wives, or were their wives free of feminism? Both of which you hear. Did feminism and marriage die together, or did feminism kill marriage? But the point is that it helps us understand the ways that we see law and culture performed here, is how the MRM both foregrounds and resists law. Right? And so I'm going to take you through some of that. How they construct their identity around law and contrarily seek to disable law. So often involved in multiple civil and criminal cases, men's rights activists, or MREs, represent themselves as being an endless legal burden. So you'll see this poster that commonly is part of one of their rotating exhibitions. It's going to set up a kind of a familiar trope by the end of it. So it's a prominent trope. You'll see it repeated in several images. So this is the husband. His gender is signified by his suitless tie, note. Is left without money or dignity. And his buxom modern wife, in pants and a low-cut top, having secured his wallet. And this smiling, cartoonish judge presiding over the process as the figure of justice. He's sort of a figure of justice, right? Because you can see those scales at the bottom of that. So he's both the judge and the figure of justice. So, but I mean, I've observed family courts for a long time, and this is not, this woman walking away with the wallet is not exactly how these outcomes come out. So don't take that as a representation of that. So, so you'll see that this movement is, I'm going to talk about law today, and so this men's rights movement is foundationally defined by its relationship to law. It is nourished by its objection to the laws of marriage. This is how people come in. This is how they become part of it. So the thing that they most are sort of energized about is the simultaneous application of criminal and civil law, and about corrupt law enforcement procedures, as you'll see in a second. So what do they want? They want fair legal process, due process they would say, and gender neutrality, by which they sort of mean gender blindness, right? Which, on their face are not particularly invalid goals, but we might look at them some more, so we can talk about them that more. So you'll see in this, this is a photograph I took of movement posters in this kind of event around International Men's Day, which is held on November 17th around the world. So this is in Delhi. You'll see how large law figures in there, right? So here they enumerate legal provisions as forms of indictment. So if you'll see, that the poster that kind of looks like a person holding a gun, it's just a set of legal provisions as a form of indictment. In other ones, they claim husbands and their families, including the female members of family, are wrongly jailed as a kind of blackmail. They blame their plight on greedy wives and power-hungry feminists. So several of these posters are like the woman over there, the woman over there. They represent this idea of the feminist who has wrought harm. Several, like that image of the woman is like someone who is a perpetrator but is pretending to use the law and be innocent, etc. So today I'm going to take you through the ways that they put faith in legal process in many arenas, from legislative to court procedure to sort of transparency questions. But they also depict law as a deeply dysfunctional arena whose logic must be undone. So, and this is a way for us to consider how discourses of justice are negotiated in various kinds of formations. So, a quick background on my research on the men's rights movement in India. So, in 2013-14 and smaller bouts since, I conducted ethnographic fieldwork with men's rights activists in across a number of Indian cities, I think 8, including interviews with movement members, movement leaders and other members, attending weekly meetings and public events, and perusing documents and media material. So, I fully appreciate the emotional toll of being sort of constantly surrounded by a whole lot of anti-feminist misogyny, but I also found that there were stories that really interested me, that I was surprised by a number of things. But generally, people have chosen to study these groups through either their media materials or through legal cases because they're wary of what might happen. So I understood that, but I sort of wanted to do fieldwork and see what it meant to talk to them anyway. So I became interested in studying the Indian MRM in researching laws of divorce. So to go back to my recent book that Phil mentioned, this work on law and violence had left me feeling quite ambivalent about how they were used together, right? These are the laws here. So you'll see that there's a combination of criminal and civil laws, right? So in the courts that I worked in, women typically struggle to receive alimony or child support payments, whether because of legal delay or because there was recidivism that people didn't actually pay up. But it was also common, it was also impossible to miss the inseparability of alimony and violence negotiated together, right? So here is how it works, right? Because civil awards were often really small, because civil awards are hard to get given sort of gendered economic disadvantage, and hence people have less negotiating power as a result. Alimony is difficult to manage in those circumstances. So the delicate equation was that the existence of domestic violence charges was believed to be useful in negotiating alimony, right? The logic was that the criminal threat of jail time, job loss, and social embarrassment would provide leverage for better settlements than civil alimony could provide. So while such leveraging attempts often proved risky for women because there was, so I followed how it required really delicate timing, it made judges angry, it required monitoring of their moral codes, sort of, but they were sometimes useful in making negotiations happen. And so women's organizations found the existence of the simultaneity kind of an important strategy, right? But nonetheless, I have argued that what they did was empty. It became, domestic violence law became a way primarily of making sure people were economically okay and not looking at violence per se. This MRM criticizes the legal strategy of filing simultaneous civil and criminal complaints in multiple cities. They anoint it, in their words, rampant misuse by unscrupulous women to extort money and harass their husbands' entire extended family. So they often talk about it as the gift hamper that follows marital trouble. They'll say it's like a sale. You get 4 for the price of 1, 4 laws filed for the price of 1. This often, it's so misogynist. There's attribution of bad faith to feminists and indeed to all women, makes it a challenge to just hear them. But there are, I thought, manifest problems with this strategic use of criminal law and its instrumental use by police and lawyers, given that families on either side can be readily extorted by corrupt law enforcement, that there are dire financial and carceral, meaning jail, consequences to it, right? So I won't go into the stories, but you can imagine I have a lot of them. Many people had cases filed, a small case filed on top of another case for years in a row. There were people who had been held liable for sort of, or taken to jail for claims that didn't seem untenable. So all of these built up an archive of kind of horror in these settings. So, and feminist groups, and as I'm saying this to you, but feminist groups have generally refrained from making these critiques for fear of providing fodder to this false complaint cloud. And many representatives of women's organizations who do anti-violence work argue, as I said, that in the given version, they couldn't get the alimony necessary for their clients without leveraging these criminal laws. But they also say that they are frustrated with police collusion and corruption and poor understanding of legal provisions by the police, with lawyers' enthusiasm for filing these multiple cases, as you'll see, and because they feel that all violence and maintenance claims begin to be viewed with suspicion as a result if there are some false claims. So in sum, the situation is a sort of legal impasse, right? With criminal law, where criminal law is an unsatisfactory form of leverage with occasional and minimal effectiveness. So that's where we stand. So I'm going to give you a brief genealogy of the men's rights movement, which was formed, as I said, in the context of these laws by way of a, fortuitous archival moment for me. So almost 20 years ago in 1992, I think many people here were not born, your professors were barely born, but I was working in this dimly lit Indian Law Institute in Delhi. So this little man about whom I remember very little went around passing around this pamphlet. So I dug it out. It seems incredible that I would have that document because I was not at all working on any of this at that time. But from there, I have this record of one of these big early moments of MRM organization. So they are this call to attention by a man who calls himself Comrade R.P. Chugh, a Delhi lawyer, who described also as a pro bono professor. I'm not sure what that means. And as a comrade, I think that indicates his left sympathies, right? So these documents lay out a campaign to, quote, prevent cruelty against husbands through a platform he named the Akhil Bharatiya Patni Atyachar Virodhi Manch, or the All India Forum in Opposition to Torture by Wives. So one pamphlet, which is mostly words, I'll describe to you. It contends that dowry and torture of wives are deceptive excuses for marital discord, leaving husbands and their families devastated because every single social and economic force, police and courts, are on the side of greedy, lying, querulous wives. That's in English. It accuses wives of appearing frail and then later looting the affinal home using dowry laws, of wives and their lovers having murdered husbands, hundreds of thousands. We can take this part to be hyperbole at the very least. Of suicidal husbands and shamed families. So women are contrasted, wives are contrasted against women who work in a range of jobs, castigated for their economic dependence on husbands, despite their refusal to participate in the marriage, right? So the argument is that they don't want to be married, but they want our money. So, and it asks, is marriage only necessary for husbands and not wives? So the other side of the pamphlet, which has more pictures, I'll show you. So it establishes this visual and discursive language for the movement, particularly in representations of law enforcement, feminist activism, and women or wives, right? So this side, as you'll see, announces this All India March Against Torture of Wives, with this large sketch of a scrawny, pathetic man being strangled by a fat woman who is holding a sign protesting women's torture. So she's in line with feminists, right? Unlike this wicked modern woman who you'll see a little bit in a second, this woman is in a sari with pendulous breasts. She's strangling him with a big grin. The feminist activist and the scheming, greedy wife are here created as a composite representation of femininity, while masculinity is represented as moribund and silent. So the reverse side, has 4 smaller vignettes. I know it's hard to see, and I have tried to translate them poorly. Once again, you'll see that it features greedy wives, devastated husbands and their families, and callous police. In one, yet another fat woman prevails against yet another scrawny man, this time in court, with the scales of justice weighed in her favor. So you can see that as a version of that thing we saw before, right? Next to it, an elderly straight couple are deemed to have aged from having to contest cases. So that could just have been, they've grown old fighting cases, right? That could be any kind of case, but here it's named to be certain kinds of dowry cases. The first panel on the bottom purports to represent a wife hauling away everything but the walls of her in-laws' house with the help of a female police officer, aided by specific laws, which you see in the background, happily abandoning it and her children and leaving everybody in despair. Here we encounter the other common representation of conniving femininity. This is the wife as too modern. Her hair is in a flip. She has this prominent jewelry. She has this sexily worn sari. You can sort of see her cleavage. So she's the obverse of the self-abnegating daughter-in-law, who's sort of a common representation in film, for example. So the hegemonic representation. And the final frame pictures the husband as dead, as carrion for 4 vultures, who are the law, crimes against women's cell, the cruel patni or the cruel wife, and the wife's family. So these things remind us of the faint beginnings of the Indian MRM in the early 90s, a short few years after this very energetic feminist organizing of the 80s had led to changes in rape law, domestic violence law, etc. So these were small actions at the time, like this movement, but the tempo of the movement increased in the new millennium, and after the Domestic Violence Act was passed in 2005, it seems to have taken on yet new energy. So it gathers under the banner organization called Save Indian Family Foundation. You can all look it up sometime. So it's called SIF, right? So I'll refer to that phrase often. So on its website, SIF describes itself as, quote, specializing in problems of men, just the way aeronautical engineers specialize in building aircrafts, countering, quote, treacherously anti-male society, and protecting the civil liberties of hundreds of thousands of people in India, which are violated as they are detained or jailed in false dowry cases by Indian government. So you'll see that if you look them up, they list themselves as a human rights organization and a civil rights organization. So reporters began to carry narratives about harassed husbands as the movement took off. And TV stations began inviting MREs and feminists to debate each other when this format of people screaming at each other on a panel became common. So initially it was only a Yahoo group, then they began to meet in person in some cities, eventually progressing to these large weekly meetings, of which I witnessed a number. So when I was working there in 2013, they deemed themselves to have been well established and accessible. I thought I would be encountering a few custodially deprived fathers, fathers who had lost custody and controlling husbands. But, I discovered anything between, 15 and 30, 40 people across a number of cities. And so, in the piece that you read, I sort of argue that there are various forms of political advocacy for cultivating citizenship, etc., that's going on through that. So organizations mushroomed in cities. I'll show you some of the names here. And you'll see the group's names prominently foreground rights discourse, speaking in the names of persecuted husbands on behalf of the notion of family and children, right? So look at the names. And at the bottom, you see the names of the women's groups: Forgotten Women's Association, Mothers and Sisters Initiative. Further, the critique that vast numbers of women are accused and jailed in the names of women's rights, right? They say that some women, such as wives, are pitted against other women who are mothers-in-law and sisters-in-law. So I found in the media that the media often covers, men who are upper middle class. They're reflecting the sort of class and caste-based privileges of literacy and communication. So these are the people who can talk to the media, more comfortably. But and also, there is this narrative that middle class and elite men are entrapped because of their incomes. They are often in the IT sector, they are often in marketing, etc. But I discovered that a good number of economically marginal men would attend the groups and were discreetly and generously provided for by the others, shared food treats or a place to live or legal advice or company, whatever. So this was kind of rare camaraderie across ethnicity, religion, and class. and their common, the ways in which they got along with each other was around a critique of gender norms and organized feminism, right? So groups in each city tended to be quite ethno-religious, linguistically diverse. They spoke different languages, there were different ethnicities. They were upper caste when Hindu, but they were quite multi-religious, and there were Muslim men were leaders in several of the cities. So, and they were resolutely unaffiliated with political parties. This is not to say that individual men might not be quite religious, but as the organization as a whole stayed away from religion and from politics. So, and I found it so cute that they followed different kind of cultures of different cities. So in Lucknow, which is a place known for its poetry, they had weekly poetry circles before their meeting started. They went to the beach in Chennai. They used a lot of IT rhetoric in Bengaluru, where several other people came from that sector. And importantly, women were primary organizers in several of the cities, including a lawyer, a journalist, a filmmaker, a women's studies professor, etc. And they had often come to the movement through the cases pertaining to their brothers and sons. So I'll talk more about this in a bit, but Save Indian Family is explicitly driven by the philosophy of one of its leaders, who believes that, branding is activism, like you have to make yourself a brand in a certain kind of way. So these are some of the deliberate political, civic, and media strategies that help further their brand. For example, visiting members of parliament, systematically working against politicians they perceive to support women's causes, encouraging members to write to politicians regularly. They place newspaper ads strategically on certain days with their phone numbers embedded. They make a point of it. They make TV show appearances, blogs, manipulating search engines so that if you look up their groups, their rendition of their explanation comes up before any feminist ones. International Men's Day events, I'll just show you a couple of images. They include an exhibition in Bengaluru. This is from Delhi, where they had this charitable meal, a langar, a conference in Kolkata. They participate in the Dream Run in Mumbai. So these are all sort of civic rituals, right? Which are also about, they're experienced as moments of camaraderie and joy, I had recorded. So I should just say that, at the beginning I met lots of people who lived alone, right? They kind of imagined, they fell within that thing. They had deliberately cut themselves off from relatives, neighbors, and friends. That they were isolated, they put all their time into the movement. They were typically in their late 20s to early 40s. Many had lost their jobs from having to go to court too much or because they had been fired for going to jail. Even those who were employed had so many court dates for years that they had a lot of travel that limited their occupational mobility. So I said that the heteronormative sociality of either romance or marital life was almost impossible for them for these long years that these cases went on. But then over time I met other people. I met their girlfriends. I met other people who had left and gone back, etc. But importantly, that many of them had sought to give up all connections with women. So we often use this word homosocial, right? The world of men. They sought to live in a world of men, to hang out together, holiday together, to spend all their spare time together. So this is what we see in this group. So I'm going to go from here to talking about law, right? And I am going to, so how might we evaluate MRA activities as forms of legal consciousness, right? I'm going to begin by giving you the 30-second version of this very large field of law and culture that we often talk about, which is kind of these two questions, right? So law and society scholars highlight how particular laws come to shape cultural attitudes and shape the worldview of communities who encounter it, right? And second, law as a form of hegemonic state power and how marginalized or precarious subjects come to rights consciousness to create space even within these hegemonic groups, right? Often in ways that might be self-defeating. That is, how people articulate notions of justice through and beyond narrow legal provisions. So my previous project that I've been describing, as well as this one, reveal a cultural shift that happened, right, in the wake of these new laws of marriage and violence. So the conflict here evokes law and governance, but it is fundamentally, I would say, located in what Nivedita Menon has called the implosion of marriage, which I would describe as follows. So the implosion is that husbands are primary income earners. Denise Candioti calls this a patriarchal bargain, right? So husbands are primary income earners and their wives are responsible for domestic labor and reproduction, right? They are economically supplied out of the husband's income that the husband earns, and the husband gets the patriarchal property. That's basically the patriarchal contract, right? So this patriarchal contract appears unstable in this environment, right? Because women are here. Women are rarely on par with men in the labor market, right? These women, and hence still need economic support in marriage. Or in divorce, but men also feel that provider expectations fail to recognize the scope of their responsibility towards their extended families, not just their wives, right? And nor does anybody care of the precarity of their employment and their income in neoliberal times. So there is no lifting of the load from their equity-minded wives, right? The wives don't share in the income earning, even though they claim to sort of aligned with feminist values. So women's changing expectations of conjugality are toward more companion egalitarian relationships, including the recalibration of both care work and formal labor, clashes with men's rage and confusion over this perceived midstream change in gender roles, right? So that is that is where ferment is happening. And I should say that in these cases, right, sometimes I feel like I am sort of providing a defense of batterers coming to court. But what you would see in court is that very often, right, the forms of domestic violence that people feel they can iterate, I am in no position to tell the truth of any of these claims, right? There's no way by studying the law you can do that. But people would often talk about everyday, these gendered everyday forms of humiliation and neglect rather than sort of gross bodily harm as we're used to thinking of in domestic violence, and which judges are more inclined to listen to. So those kinds of cases would have a different sort of hearing, because hearing the sort of daily humiliation and neglect is something that judges are not attuned to, right? And so it becomes a part of sort of the fabric of marriage. It becomes normalized in that process. So I mean, that's the landscape on which all of this is happening. So that's the that's the new cultural practice and how laws are measuring that. So for the second, the MRM strategizes to define its forms of mobilization as resistance, right? They would claim that they are resisting the hegemonic state. So that seems puzzling if we remember that MREs often have privileges of class and caste and gender, and they by definition represent what R.W. Connell famously calls hegemonic masculinity, a phrase you have maybe heard, which refers to ideas of masculinity in any given time and place that express dominant values over femininity and over forms of marginalized masculinity. So how can they be, how can they be marginalized subjects? But I'll show you a little bit that MREs pursue embodied strategies that undermine the power of hegemonic masculinity. They seek recognition through discourses of gender equity and human rights, and through emphasizing their own precarities within them. They depict themselves as socially and culturally marginal because of these laws, right? And they mobilize around law as if they are endangered and marginalized, right? Law is kind of crucial to the MRM in two or several seemingly contradictory ways. So I'm going to here show you this, and I will say that this is kind of like a summary of where we are going. So that's a kind of crucial slide if you are trying to answer your piece of paper. Sorry, that was me. So law is crucially important to the MRM in two seemingly contradictory ways, right? First, acquiring legal expertise and using a range of legal provisions for information and prosecution, marshalling forms of evidence that are effective in courts, insistence on holding the state accountable for the rule of law, and a commitment to influencing legislative process and law enforcement procedure. Right? So that's all of that, how to build better legal subjects, right? To dismiss the lawyers that exist, to be able to think with laws, to provide legal empowerment in different ways. But second is a concerted strategy of doubting law, of jamming the system further and enhancing the dysfunctionalities of delay and delivery, as we'll see. So in the rest of this presentation, I'll follow that argument. So first, thinking about how using law. So, we often talk about legal pluralism. You have been lecturing about it today. So, legal pluralism, not just as the existence of multiple systems of law, but in studying how it is. When is it that you approach law? When do you know, when do you go to law? When do you stay away from it? How do you know which law you go to? How do you not? And the cultural cues that sort of go with that. So, here you can see that MREs had become like kind of keen users of this sort of legal idea. So here we see this legally pluralist universe, it's plural universe. So many MREs would tell me that they had gone from knowing nothing about specific laws or the legal system to having trained themselves in legal knowledge based on books and the internet, right? However accurate that might be as legal information. So, and I should say that when I worked in courts, I would see that many women who had never left their houses before had also, once they had gone through divorce, had become sort of acquired legal consciousness and legal subjectivity just by going through that process. But these MRAs were like just totally sort of engaged in that process. So here's somebody telling me, the president of the Calcutta organization said to me, if you see in my mobile, I have got an app. We make people into semi-lawyers. So he said, as I watched them, men would cite clauses and cases under the Indian Penal Code and the Evidence Act. Many carried, they used to carry around these miniature copies of them, but they told me now they all have the mobile app, and the mobile app has full information on every provision of the Indian Penal Code, the Criminal Procedure Code, the Civil Procedure Code, the Evidence Act, and according to them, the Service Law Act, which it just comes that way. So they constantly, they had this keen awareness of precedent, right, and variation in local practice, like what does the UP court do versus the Delhi court, for example. So some examples in the course of one meeting in Delhi, I thought I would tell you. So they say to someone, just in one, these are the leaders talking, right? In one person, they say, don't use CCTV. Without permission, it could lead to a big 354 charge. Then second, Chopin, one of the main people at the meeting, says, we should meet in every city in every evening, but also through the internet and Twitter. Don't say anything false on the internet, because section 66 is a tough thing. In Hindi, he says section 66 ka panga hai. Third, someone says that their daughter-in-law is denying she got her dowry goods back. So the person advising says, there must be something wrong with what she's saying. There should be a PCR, meaning Protection of Civil Rights Act report with 3 copies. They should have given them a receipt, write to them and ask for them. They said, what if you have extra documents? You'll have to throw away anything. You throw away, instead of throwing away 4 pages, you'll throw away 5 pages, right? So I wanted you to notice through all of these how people talk with numbers as these sort of totemic, sort of invocations of real conversation, right? So they think in legal clauses, they think in legal numbers, etc. So, another further dimension is that MRM leaders strongly credited themselves with building more effective forms of legal subjectivity and skills than provided by, according to them, expensive lawyers who took forever and who relied on conventional legal logic. So I wanted to show you some of the things they say about lawyers. I'll let you read them. I'll read you some of them. So Vikas says, 3 people who don't know the law are the police, lawyers, and judges. Don't expect the right advice from them. Many of the leaders profess to have been radicalized in the process of having had their own lawyers, right, and having, learned the hard way. So they expressed contempt for lawyers who often showed up at their meetings with advice to launch multiple cases under various clauses, right? So Chopin said, only in the movies do we see the lawyers gather evidence for clients. In fact, both legal strategy and work are your own. And so this is part of my saying that what they're trying to do is cultivate a certain kind of different subjectivity. Vivek says, so he always says there is this approach that's a legal approach, which he distinguishes from their approach. So he says legal is a person who keeps reading citations, who wants 10 citations, who wants things that when that citation has come, he will win because there is some small thread in it. Legal is a narrow focus, basically. He doesn't understand that these judgments are they standard judgments or are they exceptional judgments? So he makes a distinction between case law, appellate law, right, versus how they know, according to them, how individual judges in individual courts deal with particular kinds of cases. So in contrast, SIF counselors depicted themselves as the strategic, informed alternative. They proffered advice based on collective experience and research, they claimed. They prided themselves on making petitions that aligned with the rules and evidence orientation of judges, rather than these relational renditions of woe, which are likely to recruit less sympathy. So Raj says, we give the best guidelines that the lawyers never give him. We sit with them, pull them down. We boost up the moral confidence. We give them some formula how to fight the cases, how to get rid of the cases, how to stop the maintenance, how to get the DV petition dismissed. So then he said, this is a Hindi sentence I'll translate for you. He said, by now, plenty of people have been helped. I've helped about every week people come to me. So now there's 15 or 20 people who I've helped who have got rid of their lawyers and are representing themselves. So I should mention that Raj is basically self-employed, and much of his time is dedicated to SIF's work. He has sort of a marginal job in real estate. So he says, what's it to me? I can help them. I have no work. I have a computer, a printer. I have all the data. So he writes things out for them, right? And he says he doesn't charge anything to folks who come in from the village or folks who earn beyond a certain, below a certain amount. So I give them the training, right? How to fight, what judge is going to ask and what I will say. So this comes from his vast experience of having fought a number of cases, he would say. So, so he had a minimal college education and he had a marginal income, and yet he, sort of was doing this all the time. So in the time, I won't describe these cases to you for the time, but in that week that I had talked to him the first time, he had helped someone, for example, he helped a cigarette vendor with a petition to file a case under the Criminal Procedure Code to get a statement about his wife's income. And then he had helped someone whose his wife was getting alimony for a while, but had filed a new claim under the Domestic Violence Act for further alimony. So he went to the judge and said, I don't have a lawyer, I'm going to represent myself. And the judge called the opposite side lawyer over and said, no more delays, let's do it today, right? So he said, this person claimed that that was a win, right? That the opposing side lawyer was caught unaware because he was counting on that delay to take him through and make him more money, right? So this is one dimension, right? So here, beyond working with individual cases for more favorable judicial incomes, the movement sought legislative change. So part of their brand was, as I said, to influence laws and policies, to go visit all the legislators, and they went to, they recruited people. They thought it was really important to recruit people to go to politicians to ask to gain visibility of the movement, but also to cultivate kind of civic consciousness in their members and to get them more committed to the movement. So they often framed claims in the language of gender equity and human rights. So they advocated for de jure gender equality, as I said. They had they were trying to petition, and indeed in the time I was there, got to be included as one of the social and cultural human rights groups within India. they had been asked by the Law Commission in various states to talk to them. Some of their recommendations had been taken in. Some of their cases were being considered by the Law Commission of India. So that legal advocacy strategy had proved not entirely successful, right? Because they asked for a Department of Men's Development in the same way there was a Women's Development Department. That kind of thing didn't go forward. But then other things that they had very specific measures about criminal law had gone ahead. So building legal citizenship was part of this dimension, right? Which was broader than legislative change. So, so this involved all the things I was telling you, going along to participate in the lobby corps, for example, to go to legislators. But they used a range of associated legal bureaucratic venues, right? Besides approaching legislators, they would regularly use RTIs or Right to Information Act things, which is sort of beloved of journalists and progressive activists, right? To assure transparency of the state. They used it for this purpose. They often talk to the National Commission for Women to point out, as I said, the rights for, these are the venues of legal advice, sorry. So they got the National Commission for Women to point out how women were being also imprisoned according to their claims. And I used to be very puzzled by this poster, but I finally realized that Japanese woman is supposed to represent, or the person represented as Japanese is supposed to be like, people of different religions are imprisoned. That's what this is shortcut for. And one of the other things is they took advantage of the senior citizens commissions to respond to all complaints, right, to have their voices heard. So in this following passage, I'll read it to you. We see Vivek at work on this goal, importuning people to cultivate civic literacy, urging them to be active subjects. So he says, he asked an older man, are you a senior citizen? He said, yeah. He said, then write to the Senior Citizens Commission. Say, is it a crime to have a son? I have worked all my life, paid taxes all my life. Why this unfairness upon me? Don't think of that no actions will result. He guarantees there will be an answer because they have committed to this answer, right? So they should write to anyone, he says to them, write to anyone you can think of. The president, the prime minister, your neighborhood chief. Someone else says, my sister-in-law's charges included his wife and mother-in-law. So the two of them said, write to the National Commission for Women, right? But other people had said to them, write to the National Commission for Women, but when they didn't, when they did so a year later, their charges were dismissed. So they told it as a story that was a triumph. So Vikas says he filed an RTI to the senior commission and found that 52 letters on the topics that they were interested in had been sent to them, including 2 from his parents. So he told people to be prepared to spend, he said, be prepared to spend rupees 100, 150 a month on letters and mailing to send out these letters every 3 months. He directs them to this blog spot. He tells them he will not write letters for them, that this is theirs to do, right? This is their task. And one final thing I want to tell you about before I talk about the failure of law is that it's not just about these legal things, but this depends also on building affect in the public sphere, right? So part of this was cultivating media literacies, right? As I said, for writing, getting people to write different kinds of blogs, right? So here is one, these are the mobilization strategies. So this is an example of one of these blogs, right? He cultivated people to write different kinds of blogs, right? So I saw one of the leaders catch a person who had been there at the meeting, said, hey, you're educated, you've got a good job, you make a blog about your story so that others can be aware of you and you will have a record. This is legal terrorism, meaning he describes the situation in that way. Stay connected through Yahoo and Twitter. It's not just your fight. You are ruined anyway. So Do it for others, you will get confidence. So, and the other ways that they build affective relationships through the public sphere is through these transnational alliances, in which, I've been working a lot on this, but I want to mention this very briefly, that the MRM frames its plights with a range of other civil society and health, political and social movement groups who foreground men's health and men's precarity, some pro-feminist and other anti-feminist. So these include the Mo's for Bros, allegedly focused on prostate cancer and depression. These are the Indian MREs who are sporting the mustache in that. This is the UN's He for She campaign. It's another version of that. This is the fathers' rights groups. I have a lot more to say about this picture, but I won't today. And then media concerns with men's suicide, right? I point out that, so they are participating in these very mainstream groups in this thing, right? But alongside, this is just sort of one dimension of that, right? This is another of the suicide things. So alongside, however, you see this participation in sort of what we think of as alt-right, very misogynist groups, etc. So this is an example that refers back to the previous, that goes back to the original poster that you see. So this is part of the manosphere, right? So here they ally with different kinds of other alt-right groups. And I won't go into this today, but I see that they're drawing from both of these for a certain kind of sort of transnational capital, right? So finally, in my final 5 minutes, I want to talk about this important subject of, so they're using all this stuff with law, but what they are trying to do is undo law, right? So MRAs live the law, right, in daily conversations, in their habits of carrying around law apps and preparing for instant surveillance, in civic practices and all the stuff I named. But the alternate, these red pill groups, legal subjectivity that they formulate is one of deep cynicism with the rule of law. Their strategies are to work along the grain of law's dysfunctionality, right, such as law's delay, legal pluralism, etc. Or to a future of, they want a future of eternal legal purgatory, of entrapping their accusers, but also themselves in the process. I'm going to just show you some examples of that. This strategy is one of slowing down law, right? Movement leaders recommend that men adopt an attitude of disciplined passivity and unyielding compliance, such that temporal delays and gendered moral assumptions work in their favor, in the men's favor. They are to be exceedingly cooperative with interim awards. When they go to court to pay interim maintenance, they should comply, but they should never raise the question of further divorce. So here is to your left, you see the president of the Kolkata branch. He gives this advice to men who come in. So in contrast to the specter of deadbeats who fail to appear in court and sullenly resisted hearings, SIF's ideal litigant was not to raise any hackles, to pay interim maintenance without defaulting, and be ready for the long haul. So it's like, they say it's like, don't negotiate with terrorists, right? Here they want to take on this minutiae of indefinite hearings, right? So here you see that Vikas, on the right, you see that he says a version of this, right? We would rather pay in court than pay you. So just give up your life, just do this, for the larger cause. So the associated criminal leverage of jail, they reject in the following way, right? By just sort of taking away the shame of jail, by sort of this bravado of saying to their wives, of baiting their wives essentially to file divorces. So, and so these performances of passive comportment, I argue, are performances of hybrid masculinity that appropriate passivity to secure advantage. Here, law is embraced because it is a waste of time and life, because it has the power to jam marriage systems and hence gender systems in the long haul. So this is the final thing I want to tell you. So, he makes this commitment to, or he urges them to this commitment of law as waste, right? So that's what I wanted to sort of show you, that we see a movement that's deeply committed to law in certain ways. They have all sorts of different strategies, but it is to simultaneously use law and to disavow law, right? And we want, I just want to say in conclusion why that's useful to us is through this we see how first, how patriarchal power is reasserted through this hybrid, passivity and vulnerability that people cultivate. But also you see the field within which feminism and human rights groups operate, right? A field that is constantly in flux. And thirdly, going back to that law and culture, how ideas of justice are negotiated by groups through the lens of law, right? That it's a constantly sort of moving field. And so, if this is the strategy that they have adopted in response to feminist groups, what's the next strategy, etc. So thank you all for your patience.